bound by twisted fate. Delilah Del Rollins had done everything to keep her father's ranch afloat, but when his gambling debts landed in Beau McGraw's hands, she had no choice but to face him. He leaned against the corral fence, his voice smooth as whiskey. "Your daddy lost big, sugar," he murmured. "But I reckon we can strike a different kind of deal." Chapter 1. The Shadow of McGraw's Claim. The letter arrived with the morning sun, casting a long, ominous shadow across the worn wooden porch of the Rollins ranch house. Del Rollins, her hands still stained with the reddish-brown earth of the field she'd been tending, felt a chill despite the burgeoning heat of the Arizona day. Her father, Silas, sat slumped in his usual chair, the cane he'd relied on since the accident leaning forgotten against the wall. He didn't need to look at the paper. The set of his jaw, the way his eyes avoided hers, told her everything. Del unfolded the stiff paper, the crispness a stark contrast to the soft, worn leather of her gloves. The words were stark, formal, yet laced with a subtle venom that made her stomach clench. It was from a law firm in Tucson, representing one Beauregard McGraw. The name was a brand on her memory, a whispered curse in the saloons of Dust Devil, the nearest town, a place she avoided as much as possible. McGraw was a man who collected debts like a hawk collected prey, relentlessly and without mercy. The letter detailed the outstanding debt Silas owed McGraw, a sum that made Del's breath catch in her throat. It was more than the ranch was worth, more than they could ever hope to repay. Years of drought, dwindling cattle herds, and Silas's increasing reliance on the fleeting promises of the gambling table had culminated in this. The final line was the cruelest. McGraw was calling in the debt. He would arrive at the Rollins ranch in 1 week's time to discuss arrangements. Del lowered the letter, her gaze sweeping across the land she loved, the land her family had bled for generations. Rolling hills, dotted with mesquite and saguaro cacti, stretched out before her, bathed in the golden light of the rising sun. The scent of dust and sage hung heavy in the air, a familiar comfort that now felt like a shroud. "He's coming here?" Silas finally spoke, his voice raspy, tinged with a shame he couldn't quite conceal. Del nodded, her throat tight. "A week." "Damn fool that I am," he muttered, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon. "Lost it all, Del. Every last penny." Del didn't reply. She knew the litany of his regrets by heart. She'd heard them whispered into the crackling embers of the fireplace on countless cold nights, seen them reflected in the bottom of too many empty whiskey glasses. She'd borne the brunt of his self-loathing, his anger, his despair for years. But this was different. This was the end. She walked to the edge of the porch, her hand resting on the weathered railing. The wood was rough beneath her fingers, worn smooth in places by the countless hands that had gripped it before hers. Her grandmothers, her mothers, all women who had fought to keep this ranch alive, who had faced hardship with a quiet strength that Del had always strived to emulate. Now, it seemed, their legacy was about to be ripped away. The image of Beau McGraw formed in her mind, pieced together from the scraps of gossip and rumors she'd overheard. A tall man, they said, with eyes as cold and sharp as flint. A gambler, a businessman, a man who knew how to exploit weakness, a man who always got what he wanted. He was a predator, and they were his prey. Del had always been a practical woman. She'd learned to mend fences, brand cattle, and shoot a rattlesnake before she'd learned to dance. Sentimentality was a luxury she couldn't afford. But looking out at the land, at the small, weathered house that held so many memories, she felt a surge of fierce protectiveness, a primal instinct to defend what was hers. She turned back to her father, her expression hardening. "We won't let him take it, Pa." Silas looked up, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes. "Del, there's nothing we can do. It's his. Legally." "Legally?" Del scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Since when has the law ever cared about us? About folks like us?" She knew the law was a fickle thing out here, often bending to the will of the powerful, the wealthy. McGraw had both. But Del had something else. She had grit, determination, and a deep-seated love for this land that ran deeper than any law, any debt. She straightened her shoulders, her gaze unwavering. We'll find a way.
We always have.
The week passed in a blur of frantic activity. Dell rode out to the furthest reaches of their property, checking on the remaining cattle, herding them closer to the ranch house. She mended fences, repaired the leaky roof of the barn, and tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that settled heavier with each passing day. She barely spoke to Silas, who spent most of his time staring out the window, lost in his own world of regret and despair. The silence between them was thick with unspoken accusations, with the weight of years of disappointment. On the morning of McGraw's arrival, Dell rose before dawn. She dressed in her sturdiest riding clothes, a worn denim skirt and a faded blue shirt. She braided her long, dark hair, her fingers moving with practiced ease. She strapped on her father's old Colt revolver, the weight of it a familiar comfort against her hip. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the desert in hues of gold and orange, she saw him. A lone rider, approaching from the east, a cloud of dust billowing behind him.
Beau Macro.
He rode with an easy confidence, his posture straight, his gaze fixed on the ranch house. As he drew closer, Dell could see the details of his appearance. He was indeed tall, with a lean, muscular build. His face was tanned and weathered, his features sharp and defined. His eyes, as he dismounted and approached the porch, were even colder than she'd imagined, a steely gray that seemed to pierce right through her. He was dressed impeccably, his clothes clean and well-made, a stark contrast to the dusty surroundings. A silver concho belt gleamed at his waist, and a Stetson hat shaded his eyes. He stopped a few feet from the porch, his gaze sweeping over Dell, assessing her with a cool detachment that made her skin crawl. "Miss Rollins, I presume?" His voice was smooth, like aged whiskey, with a hint of a southern drawl. Dell met his gaze, her chin lifted. "Mr. McGraw." He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your daddy lost big, sugar," he murmured, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But I reckon we can strike a different kind of deal." He leaned closer, his shadow falling over her. The scent of expensive cologne and something darker, something wilder, filled her nostrils. He looked past her, toward the dilapidated house, to where her father was a slumped silhouette. What would he offer? What depravity would save her home, and at what cost? Chapter 2. A bargain struck in dust and desperation. Dell held her breath, her hand instinctively moving to the worn leather of the holster at her hip. The gesture wasn't lost on McGraw. A flicker of amusement danced in his cold eyes. He didn't seem threatened, only intrigued. "A different kind of deal?" Dell repeated, her voice deliberately steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside her. She needed to know to understand the game he was playing before she could even begin to formulate a response. McGraw straightened, taking a step back, giving her a sliver of space, though the oppressive weight of his presence remained. He gestured towards the two rickety chairs on the porch. "May we sit, Miss Rollins? This discussion might take a while." Dell hesitated, then nodded curtly. She sat in one chair, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. McGraw settled into the other, stretching out his long legs, his posture relaxed, almost casual, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the fate of her family's legacy. Silas remained a silent, shadowy figure in the doorway, a testament to his broken spirit. Dell wished, for a fleeting moment, that he would find some semblance of his former strength, that he would stand beside her, but she knew it was a futile hope. She was alone in this. "Your father, as you know, accumulated a considerable debt," McGraw began, his voice losing some of its earlier mocking tone. He spoke matter-of-factly, like a banker reciting figures, yet Dell sensed the underlying steel, the unyielding will that lay beneath the surface. A debt he was unable to repay. Dell didn't respond, her gaze fixed on his face, searching for any hint of weakness, any crack in his carefully constructed facade. She found none. "The ranch, as collateral, is now mine," he continued, his eyes flicking towards the vast expanse of land surrounding them. "But I'm not a rancher, Miss Rollins. I have other interests." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, the silence punctuated only by the chirping of cicadas and the distant lowing of cattle. Dell felt a knot of tension tighten in her stomach. What were his interests? And how did she fit into them? "I'm a businessman," McGraw finally said, his gaze locking with hers. "And I see potential here." "Potential in you." Dell's heart pounded against her ribs. This was worse than she'd feared. She'd braced herself for demands of money, for threats of eviction, but this was something far more insidious. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. McGraw leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're a strong woman, Miss Rollins. Resourceful. I've made inquiries. You practically run this ranch single-handedly. You have grit, determination, qualities I admire." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I need someone like you. Someone I can trust. Someone to manage my affairs." In Dust Devil. The town she loathed, the town that had swallowed her father whole. The town where McGraw held sway, where his influence reached into every corner, every saloon, every gambling den. "Manage your affairs?" Dell repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "You want me to work for you? In Dust Devil?" McGraw smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Not just work for me, Miss Rollins. Partner with me. I have plans. Big plans. And I need someone local, someone with your skills to help me realize them." The offer was outrageous, insulting, and yet a sliver of hope flickered within her. It was a chance, however slim, to save the ranch, to keep her family's legacy intact. But at what cost? To become entangled with Beau McGraw, to become a part of his world, a world of shadows and secrets, it was a dangerous game. "And if I refuse?" Dell asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to control it. McGraw's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "Then the ranch is mine. You and your father will be evicted. Immediately." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Dell looked at Silas, still slumped in the doorway, his face etched with despair. She looked at the land, at the house, at everything she held dear. She had no choice. What kind of plans?" she asked, her voice barely audible. McGraw leaned back, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. He knew he had her. "Let's just say Dust Devil is about to become a very profitable town. And you, Miss Rollins, will be at the heart of it all." He named his price. A sum of money, yes, regular payments to keep the ranch afloat. A share from the profits, from a business she still didn't understand, but which will be substantial. And her presence, by his side, lending a facade of local respectability to whatever scheme he planned to hatch. He gave her 24 hours. The sun began to set, and the long shadows crept towards her, as long as the one cast that morning. It seemed she'd have no choice at all. Chapter 3. The Weight of Unforgiven Debts. The 24 hours stretched before Dell like the vast, unforgiving desert itself. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, each tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway a hammer blow against her dwindling hope. Sleep was a distant, unattainable luxury. She paced the worn floorboards of the house, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Resentment, sharp and bitter, warred with a desperate, clinging hope. Resentment towards her father, whose weakness had brought them to this precipice. Resentment towards McGraw, whose cold calculation held her family's fate in his hands. And resentment towards herself, for even considering this Faustian bargain. But beneath the resentment, a flicker of defiance remained. She wouldn't be broken. She wouldn't be a pawn in McGraw's game. She would find a way to navigate this treacherous path, to protect the ranch, and to emerge unscathed. If that was even possible. She spent the morning in a flurry of activity, trying to distract herself from the looming deadline. She checked on the cattle, her hands moving automatically through the familiar routines. She mended a broken section of fence, the rhythmic pounding of the hammer a temporary balm to her frayed nerves. But even the familiar comfort of the land couldn't completely erase the knot of dread in her stomach. Every glance towards the horizon, every distant sound, brought with it the image of McGraw, his cold eyes, his predatory smile. She found Silas sitting on the porch, staring out at the empty landscape. He looked older, more defeated than ever. The lines on his face seemed to have deepened overnight, etched by years of regret, and now, this final, crushing blow. Dell sat beside him, the silence stretching between them, thick and uncomfortable. She wanted to scream at him, to rail against his weakness, to blame him for everything. But she couldn't. She saw the pain in his eyes, the deep, abiding sorrow that mirrored her own. "I'm sorry, Dell," he finally whispered, his voice raspy and broken. "I ruined everything." Dell didn't reply. She couldn't offer him forgiveness, not yet. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. But she also couldn't condemn him. He was her father, flawed and broken, but still her father. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Dell took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I'm going to fight, Pa. I'm going to fight for this ranch, for our family, for everything we've ever worked for." She didn't tell him about McGraw's offer, about the bargain she was contemplating. She couldn't bear to see the shame in his eyes, the knowledge that his daughter was being forced to compromise herself to save what he had lost. As the day wore on, Dell's resolve began to harden. She wouldn't be a victim. She would use this opportunity, however dangerous, to her advantage. She would learn McGraw's secrets, understand his plans, and find a way to turn the tables on him. She knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but she had nothing left to lose. In the late afternoon, she rode out to the old abandoned well on the edge of their property. It was a place she'd often come to as a child, a place of solitude and reflection. The well was dry, its wooden frame crumbling and weathered, a testament to the harshness of the land. Dell dismounted, her legs stiff from the long ride. She sat on the edge of the well, her gaze fixed on the deep, dark hole below. It was a mirror of her own soul, a reflection of the darkness she was about to enter. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath of the dry desert air. She thought of her mother, of her grandmother, of all the strong women who had come before her. She drew strength from their memory, from their resilience, from their unwavering love for this land. When she opened her eyes, her decision was made. She would accept McGraw's offer, but she would do it on her own terms. She would be his partner, yes, but she would also be his adversary. She would play his game, but she would play it to win. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape, Dell rode back to the ranch house. She found a note tacked to the door, a single sheet of paper with McGraw's distinctive, elegant script. "Meet me in Dust Devil. Tomorrow at noon. The Golden Spur Saloon.
Come alone."
The words were a command, a challenge, and a promise. Dell crumpled the note in her hand, her jaw set, her eyes burning with a fierce determination. She would be there. And Beau McGraw would soon learn that he had underestimated Delilah Rollins. The moon watched her as she rode, a silent witness to her gamble. The only question was, would it see her win, or witness her fall? Chapter 4. Echoes of Loss in the Canyon Winds. The ride to Dust Devil was a journey through Dell's past as much as it was a physical passage across the parched landscape. Every familiar landmark, every twisted juniper tree, every dry creek bed, evoked memories, some bittersweet, others sharp with pain. She passed the spot where her mother had taught her to track a deer, the memory of her mother's warm smile and patient guidance a fleeting comfort. She rode through the canyon where she and her childhood friend, Caleb, had spent countless hours exploring, their laughter echoing through the towering red rock walls. Caleb, with his bright eyes and infectious grin, was gone now, a victim of a fever that had swept through the town years ago. Another loss, another scar on Dell's heart. The closer she got to Dust Devil, the more the memories shifted, becoming darker, more unsettling. She remembered the taunts of the other children, the whispers about her father's gambling, the shame she'd felt whenever she had to venture into town. She remembered the leering glances of the men in the saloons, the feeling of being an outsider, a target. Dust Devil was a town built on greed and desperation, a place where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card, where lives were cheap and honor was a rare commodity. It was a town that had taken much from her, and now, it seemed, it was about to take even more. As she rode into the outskirts of town, Dell felt a familiar knot of tension tighten in her stomach. The town was much as she remembered it, a dusty, ramshackle collection of buildings clustered around the main street. Saloons, gambling dens, and a few struggling businesses lined the road, their false fronts and faded signs a testament to the town's precarious existence. The Golden Spur Saloon was the largest and most imposing building in town, its two-story facade adorned with ornate carvings and a swinging sign depicting a golden spur. The sounds of raucous laughter, clinking glasses, and the tinny piano music spilled out into the street. Dell hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the reins. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She dismounted, tying her horse to the hitching rail, her movements deliberate and cautious. She adjusted her hat, pulling it low over her eyes, and straightened her shirt, smoothing out the wrinkles. She wanted to appear confident in control, even though her heart was pounding like a runaway train. As she pushed open the saloon doors, she was immediately enveloped by a wave of noise, smoke, and the pungent smell of stale beer and sweat. The room was dimly lit, the only sources of light being the flickering oil lamps on the walls and the sunlight streaming in through the grimy windows. Men, a rough-looking assortment of cowboys, miners, and gamblers, filled the room. They turned to look at her as she entered, their eyes assessing her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Dell ignored them, her gaze sweeping the room, searching for McGraw. She spotted him in a corner booth, sitting alone, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. He nodded towards the empty seat across from him. Dell walked towards him, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. She felt the eyes of every man in the room on her, their gazes heavy and intrusive. She kept her head high, her shoulders squared, refusing to show any sign of weakness. She reached the booth and slid into the seat opposite McGraw. The table was sticky with spilled liquor, and the air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke. "You came," McGraw said, his voice low and smooth. He didn't seem surprised. "I said I would," Dell replied, her voice equally low, her gaze unwavering. He studied her for a moment, his eyes lingering on her face, her hands, the worn leather of her holster. He seemed to be searching for something, some sign of hesitation, of fear. He found none. "Good," he said finally, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I like a woman who keeps her word." He took a sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. "I trust you've considered my proposition?" "I have," Dell replied. "And I accept. On certain conditions." McGraw raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Conditions?" "Yes," Dell said, her voice firm. "The ranch stays in my family's name. No interference from you or your associates. And I have a say in any decisions that affect it." McGraw chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss Rollins." "I'm not bargaining, Mr. McGraw," Dell said, her voice cold. "I'm stating my terms. Take them or leave them." He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. He studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, punctuated only by the noise of the saloon. Finally, he nodded. "Agreed," he said. "But understand this, Miss Rollins. You're in my world now. And in my world, loyalty is everything. Betray me, and you'll pay the price." He gestured to a man standing near the bar, a burly figure with a scarred face and cold, dead eyes. Dell followed his gaze, and as she saw the stranger, she felt the danger rise like bile. He was watching. Chapter 5. Thorns beneath the blooming desert rose. The man McGraw had indicated didn't move, didn't even blink. He simply stood there, a silent, menacing presence, a constant reminder of the stakes Dell was now playing for. She met his gaze for a brief moment, a chill running down her spine, before turning back to McGraw. "I understand loyalty," Dell said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "But loyalty is a two-way street, Mr. McGraw. You expect it from me, and I expect it in return. McGraw smiled, a slow, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. Fair enough, Miss Rollins. Fair enough. He raised his glass in a mock toast. To our partnership. Dell didn't return the toast. She simply nodded, her gaze unwavering. She wouldn't be seduced by his charm, by his false promises. She knew she was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. He then laid out the beginnings of his plan, the broad strokes of a scheme that involved buying up land around Dust Devil, land that was rumored to be rich in minerals. He spoke of building a railroad spur, of bringing in investors, of transforming the sleepy, forgotten town into a boomtown. Dell listened carefully, her mind racing. She knew nothing about railroads or mining, but she understood land. She understood the value of water, of grazing rights, of the delicate balance of the desert ecosystem. And she understood the greed that drove men like McGraw, the insatiable hunger for wealth and power. He needed her, he said, to navigate the local landscape, to deal with the landowners, many of whom were wary of outsiders, suspicious of his grand ambitions. He needed her credibility, her connection to the land, to smooth the way for his plans. You know these people, Miss Rollins, he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. You speak their language. You can convince them to sell. Dell remained silent, her expression carefully neutral. She was beginning to understand the scope of his ambition, the potential for both profit and destruction. She was also beginning to see her own role in this, not just as a pawn, but as a potential player. And what if they refused to sell? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. McGraw's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard expression. They won't, he said, his voice flat. I always get what I want, Miss Rollins. One way or another. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Dell felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew she was dealing with a dangerous man, a man who wouldn't hesitate to use force, intimidation, or worse, to achieve his goals. The meeting continued for another hour, McGraw outlining the details of his plan, Dell listening, questioning, probing for weaknesses, for opportunities. She learned that he had already acquired several key parcels of land, that he had connections in Tucson and beyond, that he was a man with considerable resources and influence. As the meeting drew to a close, McGraw leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her intently. You're a smart woman, Miss Rollins, he said. Smarter than I initially gave you credit for. Don't underestimate me, Mr. McGraw, Dell replied, her voice steady. I may be a rancher's daughter, but I'm not naive. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. I can see that. And that's exactly why I chose you. You have potential. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. I'll be in touch, he said. We have a lot of work to do. Dell nodded, rising to her feet. She felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. She had survived the first encounter, but she knew this was just the beginning. The real game had just begun. As she walked towards the saloon doors, she felt McGraw's eyes on her back, a constant reminder of his presence, his power. She also felt the gaze of the scarred man by the bar, his eyes cold and watchful. She pushed open the doors and stepped out into the bright sunlight, taking a deep breath of the dusty air. She needed to clear her head, to think, to plan. She had entered into a dangerous alliance, a partnership with a man she didn't trust, a man who could destroy her and everything she held dear. But she had also taken the first step towards saving her family's legacy. She had stepped into the shadows, but she was determined to find her way back into the light. As she reached for her horse's reins, a voice, low and gravelly, stopped her. It was the scarred man. He'd followed her out. McGraw's a snake, he said without preamble. But even snakes have their uses. What did that mean? Chapter 6. A glimmer of trust in calloused hands. Dell turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving to the butt of her revolver. The scarred man stood a few feet away, his hands empty, his posture relaxed, yet his eyes held a warning. He was older than she'd first thought, his face a roadmap of hard living, etched with lines of experience and pain. The scar that bisected his left cheek was a jagged, angry red, a permanent reminder of some past violence. What do you mean? Dell asked, her voice cautious, her gaze unwavering. She didn't trust this man, any more than she trusted McGraw, but his words had struck a chord. He shrugged, a slight movement of his broad shoulders. Just saying, watch your back. McGraw ain't one to share. He takes what he wants, and he don't care who he steps on to get it. I'm aware of that, Dell replied, her voice dry. She'd already seen enough of McGraw to know that he was ruthless and ambitious. The man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. He's got plans for this town, big plans. And he'll use anyone, anything, to get what he wants. Even you. Dell remained silent, her mind racing. Why was this man warning her? What was his motive? Was he a rival of McGraw's? A disgruntled former employee? Or something else entirely?
Who are you?
She asked, her voice direct. He smiled, a grim, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. Name's Jedediah. Jed to most. Let's just say I've crossed paths with McGraw before. And I've got the scars to prove it. He touched the scar on his cheek, his fingers tracing its jagged outline. Dell studied him, trying to assess his truthfulness. He seemed genuine, his warning sincere, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he was letting on. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Jed shrugged again. Maybe I don't like seeing a woman like you getting used. Maybe I'm tired of seeing McGraw get away with everything. Maybe I just like causing trouble. He paused, his eyes locking with hers. Or maybe I see a bit of myself in you. Someone who's been dealt a bad hand, but ain't afraid to fight back. Dell felt a flicker of something. Recognition? Empathy? She wasn't sure, but she saw the pain in his eyes, the weariness that mirrored her own. She saw the scars, both visible and invisible, that spoke of a life lived on the edge. I can handle myself, she said, her voice firm. She wouldn't show him any weakness, any vulnerability. Jed nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. I can see that. But even the strongest need a hand sometimes. Especially in a town like Dust Devil. He paused, then added, his voice low and serious. If you ever need help or just someone to talk to, you can find me at the old livery stable on the edge of town. I keep to myself mostly, but I'm around. He turned to leave, then stopped, looking back at her over his shoulder. One more thing. Don't trust anyone in this town. Not even the ones who seem to be on your side. Especially not them. With that, he walked away, disappearing into the dusty street, leaving Dell with more questions than answers. She watched him go, her mind swirling with confusion and uncertainty. Who was Jedediah? And why had he chosen to warn her? Was he a genuine ally, a potential source of help in this dangerous game? Or was he another player, another piece in McGraw's intricate web? She mounted her horse, her thoughts still tangled. She rode slowly out of town, her gaze scanning the faces of the people she passed, searching for any sign of what?
Deception?
Conspiracy?
She didn't know.
Jed's words echoed in her mind. Don't trust anyone. It was a harsh lesson, but one she was quickly learning. In Dust Devil, it seemed everyone had their own agenda, their own secrets, their own reasons for playing the game. As she rode back towards the ranch, the setting sun casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape, she felt a growing sense of isolation, of loneliness. She was surrounded by enemies, by potential betrayers, by people who wanted to use her for their own gain. But she also felt a flicker of hope, a spark of defiance. Jed's words, his warning, had also given her something else, a sense of camaraderie, perhaps. The knowledge that she wasn't completely alone, that there was at least one person in Dust Devil who understood her struggle, who might be willing to help. It was a small thing, a fragile thread of trust in a world of deception, but it was enough to give her strength, to renew her determination. She wouldn't be broken.
She wouldn't be used.
She would find a way to navigate this treacherous path, to protect her family, and to emerge victorious. The wind picked up and howled as she rode, like a lone wolf. But was it a warning or a call to a pack she didn't know she had? Chapter 7. The Unspoken Language of the Frontier. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Dell found herself immersed in McGraw's world, a world of land deals, whispered negotiations, and veiled threats. She traveled with him to neighboring ranches, to dusty, forgotten corners of the county, where he sought to acquire the land he needed for his grand scheme. Dell quickly learned that McGraw's methods were unconventional. He used a combination of charm, intimidation, and outright bribery to persuade, or coerce, landowners into selling. He had a network of informants, spies, and enforcers who did his bidding, ensuring that his offers were difficult to refuse. Dell played her part, using her knowledge of the land, of the people, to smooth the way for his acquisitions. She spoke the language of the frontier, the unspoken language of shared hardship, of mutual respect, of the delicate balance between survival and ruin. She understood the ranchers' concerns, their fears, their reluctance to sell land that had been in their families for generations. She listened to their stories, their grievances, their hopes, and she used that knowledge to her advantage and to theirs whenever she could. She negotiated fair prices, ensured that water rights were protected, that grazing leases were honored. She tried, in her own way, to mitigate the damage McGraw was inflicting, to soften the blow of his relentless ambition. It was a delicate dance, a constant balancing act. She had to maintain McGraw's trust, to convince him that she was a loyal and valuable asset, while also protecting her own interests, her own values, and the interests of the people she was ostensibly helping him to exploit. She saw the resentment in the eyes of some of the ranchers, the suspicion, the unspoken accusations. They saw her as a traitor, a collaborator, someone who had sold out to the enemy. She couldn't blame them. She felt the shame, the guilt, gnawing at her conscience. But she also saw the flicker of hope in their eyes, the gratitude for the small concessions she was able to secure, the recognition that she was, perhaps, the only thing standing between them and complete ruin. She spent her evenings at the ranch, tending to the cattle, repairing fences, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy in her increasingly chaotic life. She barely spoke to Silas, who remained lost in his own world of regret and despair. The silence between them was a heavy, suffocating presence, a constant reminder of the debt that hung over them, the bargain she had struck. She found herself thinking of Jedediah, of his warning, of his offer of help. She hadn't sought him out, yet she was wary of trusting anyone, of revealing her true feelings, her doubts, her fears. But his words lingered in her mind, a small beacon of hope in the darkness. One evening, as she was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, she saw a rider approaching. It was McGraw. He dismounted, his posture relaxed, his expression almost friendly. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, a glimpse of the man beneath the ruthless businessman. "You've been doing good work, Dell," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Better than I expected." Dell nodded, her expression carefully neutral. She wouldn't be fooled by his compliments, by his attempts at charm. "I'm just doing what I agreed to do," she replied. He sat beside her on the porch, the silence stretching between them, comfortable, for once, rather than strained. He looked out at the landscape, his gaze lingering on the distant mountains. "This land, it's in your blood, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft, almost wistful. Dell nodded, surprised by his observation. "It is," she replied. "It's everything to me." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "I understand that," he said. "I had land once, back east. Lost it. Long story." He paused, then added, his voice tinged with a hint of regret. "That's why I do what I do. To get it back. To build something lasting." Dell studied him, trying to decipher his true meaning. Was he trying to justify his actions? To gain her sympathy? Or was he simply revealing a glimpse of his own humanity? She didn't know, but she saw, for the first time, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a hint of the pain that drove him. It was a fleeting moment, quickly masked, but it was there. "We all have our losses, Mr. McGraw," she said, her voice quiet. "It's how we deal with them that matters." He nodded, his gaze returning to the landscape. The sun had set, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. He stood, looking at the horizon. "We are more alike than you think, Del." And for the first time, Del started to wonder if the statement was true. He was, after all, just a man. But was that a comfort or a greater danger? Chapter 8. Scars that Whisper of a Shared Past. The following day, McGraw took Del to a different part of the county, a remote canyon area where he planned to build a holding pen for the cattle he was acquiring. It was a rugged, isolated spot, accessible only by a narrow, winding trail. As they rode, Del noticed a change in McGraw's demeanor. He was quieter, more introspective than usual, his gaze often drifting towards the distant horizon. He seemed preoccupied, as if his mind were elsewhere. They reached the canyon, a narrow gorge with towering red rock walls. The air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the narrow passage. McGraw dismounted, his movements stiff and deliberate. He walked to the edge of the canyon, his gaze fixed on the rocky floor below. Del watched him, her curiosity piqued. She sensed that this place held some significance for him, some connection to his past. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice quiet, respectful. McGraw didn't answer for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on the canyon floor. Then he spoke, his voice low and distant. "My brother died here," he said. "Years ago." Del was surprised by his sudden candor, by the raw emotion in his voice. She hadn't expected this glimpse into his personal history. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice sincere. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a pain she hadn't seen before. "He was reckless. Like your father." The comparison stung, but Del held her tongue. She wanted to hear his story, to understand the source of his darkness. "We were hunting," McGraw continued, his voice flat, emotionless now.
He fell.
"It was an accident." Del sensed that there was more to the story, that he was holding something back. But she didn't press him. She simply waited, letting him speak at his own pace. "I tried to save him," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I couldn't." He closed his eyes, his face etched with a pain that was both ancient and fresh. Del felt a surge of empathy, a connection to his loss, to his grief. She knew what it was like to lose someone, to feel the weight of responsibility, of guilt, even when there was nothing you could have done. "It wasn't your fault," she said, her voice soft. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable.
"Maybe," he said.
"Maybe not." He turned away, his gaze returning to the canyon floor. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Del didn't know what to say. She couldn't offer him comfort, not when she barely knew him, not when she was still wary of his motives, his intentions. But she understood, on some level, the pain he carried, the scars that whispered of a shared past, a shared experience of loss and regret. As they rode back to Dust Devil, Del found herself thinking about Jedediah again. She wondered if he knew about McGraw's brother, if he knew the story of this place. She decided she would seek him out, ask him about it. She found him at the livery stable, as he'd said, tending to a horse. He looked up as she approached, his expression guarded. "Back again?" he asked, his voice neutral. "I need to ask you something," Del said, her voice direct. "About McGraw." Jed nodded, his eyes narrowing. "What about him?" "He took me to a canyon today," Del said. "Said his brother died there. Years ago." Jed's expression changed, a flicker of something crossing his face. "Recognition? Understanding?" "Eagle Canyon," he said, his voice low. "Yeah, I know the place." "Do you know what happened?" Del asked. Jed hesitated, then nodded. "I heard stories. Rumors. They say it wasn't an accident." Del's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" Jed leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They say McGraw killed him. That they were fighting over something, money, land, a woman, who knows? But the story goes that McGraw pushed him, that he let him fall." Del felt a chill run down her spine. She'd sensed that there was more to the story, that McGraw was hiding something. But this was worse than she'd imagined. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jed shrugged. "Who knows? It was a long time ago, and there were no witnesses. Except McGraw." He paused, then added, his voice serious. "But I'll tell you this, Dell. McGraw ain't a man to be trusted. He's got a darkness in him, a coldness that runs deep. And he'll do whatever it takes to get what he wants. No matter who gets hurt." He looked at her, straight in the eyes. "Be careful, Dell. The man carries death around him, like a second skin." The canyon had told its tale, whispered through Jed. But was it the truth, or just another frontier legend, as dangerous and shifting as the desert sands? Chapter 9. The Serpent in the Garden of Reprieve. Jed's words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, casting a shadow over Dell's already troubled thoughts. She rode back to the ranch slowly, her mind reeling. Could McGraw be a murderer? Had he killed his own brother? The possibility was chilling, and yet it also made a strange kind of sense. It explained the darkness she'd sensed in him, the ruthlessness, the cold calculation. She found Silas sitting on the porch, staring out at the empty landscape. He looked up as she approached, his expression blank, unreadable. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice flat. Dell hesitated. She couldn't tell him the truth, not all of it. She couldn't tell him about McGraw's brother, about Jed's accusations. It would only add to his burden, his despair. "Working," she replied, her voice evasive. "Trying to keep this ranch afloat." Silas nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. He didn't press her for details. He seemed to have lost interest in everything, even his own fate. Dell went inside, the house feeling empty and cold despite the lingering warmth of the day. She made herself a cup of coffee, the strong, bitter brew a temporary comfort. She sat at the kitchen table, her mind racing. She needed to find out more about McGraw, about his past. She needed to know if Jed's story was true, if she was dealing with a murder. But how? She couldn't ask McGraw directly. He would only lie, or worse. She thought of the upcoming town meeting, a gathering of all the landowners in the county, called by McGraw himself. He'd said it was to discuss his plans for the railroad, for the development of Dust Devil. But Dell suspected it was more than that. It was a show of force, a way for him to assert his dominance, to intimidate any potential opposition. She decided she would use the meeting as an opportunity to gather information, to observe McGraw, to talk to the other ranchers, to see if she could find any clues, any evidence to support Jed's accusations. The meeting was held in the Golden Spur Saloon, the largest venue in town. The room was packed, filled with a mix of ranchers, businessmen, and townsfolk. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation, with a sense of unease. McGraw stood on a makeshift stage, his posture confident, his expression commanding. He spoke of progress, of prosperity, of the bright future that awaited Dust Devil. He painted a picture of a thriving town, a hub of commerce and industry, a place where fortunes could be made. His words were met with a mixture of applause and silence. Some of the ranchers seemed swayed by his vision, by his promises of wealth. Others remained skeptical, their faces etched with suspicion and distrust. Dell watched McGraw carefully, studying his every move, his every gesture. He seemed different tonight. More animated, more passionate, almost manic. She sensed a heightened energy in him, a barely contained excitement that bordered on instability. During a break in the proceedings, Dell mingled with the crowd, trying to strike up conversations, to glean any information she could. She spoke to several ranchers, some of whom she knew, others who were strangers. She heard whispers of discontent, of resentment towards McGraw, of fear of his growing power. But no one was willing to speak openly, to challenge him directly. They were afraid, intimidated by his wealth, his influence, his reputation. Dell found herself drawn to a group of older ranchers, men who had lived in the county for decades, who knew its history, its secrets. She listened to their conversations, their quiet grumbling, their veiled criticisms of McGraw. One of them, a grizzled old man named Eben, caught her eye. He looked at her with a knowing expression, a hint of warning in his eyes. "Be careful," Girl, he said, his voice low and raspy. That man, he's a snake. He'll charm you, he'll promise you the world, but he'll bite you in the end. Dell felt a chill run down her spine. His words echoed Jed's warning, confirming her own growing suspicions. What do you know about him? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eben glanced around, making sure no one was listening. I know he's got a past, he said. A dark past. And he ain't afraid to use it to get what he wants. He paused, then added, his voice even lower. They say he killed his own brother. Back east. Over some land dispute. Dell's heart pounded. It was the same story Jed had told her. Was it true? Or was it just a rumor, a legend, fueled by fear and distrust? Before she could ask him more, McGraw approached, his eyes narrowing as he saw her talking to Eben. Miss Rollins, he said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. I need to speak with you. Privately. He took Dell's arm possessively and smiled broadly at the old-timer. Enjoying the evening, Eben? It wasn't a question. And as McGraw led her away, Dell caught the old man's expression one last time. It wasn't just fear. It was pity. Chapter 10. A storm brewing on the horizon. McGraw led Dell to a small, private room behind the bar, a dimly lit space furnished with a table and a couple of chairs. The air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and spilled liquor. He closed the door behind them, his expression hardening. What were you talking to Eben about? He asked, his voice sharp. Dell met his gaze, her chin lifted. Just getting to know the locals, she replied, her voice steady. Isn't that what you wanted? He studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be trying to gauge her truthfulness, to detect any hint of deception. Eben's a troublemaker, he said finally, his voice flat. A bitter old man who resents anyone who's successful. Don't listen to him. He seemed to know you, Dell said, her voice carefully neutral. McGraw's eyes narrowed. He knows of me, he corrected. Everyone in this county knows of me. That's the point. He paused, then added, his voice softening slightly. Look, Dell, I know this isn't easy for you. You're caught in the middle, between your loyalty to your family, to your land, and this new world I'm building. But I need you to trust me. Dell remained silent, her expression unreadable. Trust him? How could she trust a man who might be a murderer, a man who used lies and intimidation to get what he wanted? I'm offering you a chance, Dell, McGraw continued, his voice persuasive. A chance to be a part of something big, something important. A chance to secure your future, your family's future. He stepped closer, his eyes locking with hers. Don't let the whispers of old men and jealous rivals poison your mind. I'm not the monster they make me out to be. Dell felt a strange mixture of emotions. Doubt, suspicion, but also a flicker of something else. A reluctant admiration, perhaps, for his ambition, his drive, his unwavering belief in himself. I'm not afraid of monsters, Mr. McGraw, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I've dealt with them before. He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down her spine. I know you have, he said. That's why I chose you. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She pulled her hand away, her heart pounding. Don't, she said, her voice sharp. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Don't what, Dell? Don't touch you? Don't offer you a future? Don't tempt you? Dell felt her cheeks flush. She was angry, yes, but also flustered, confused. His words, his touch, had awakened something within her. Something she'd thought long dead. I'm not interested in your temptations, Mr. McGraw, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I'm here to do a job. Nothing more. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. We'll see about that, Dell. We'll see. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. The storm's coming, Dell. You can feel it, can't you? A big storm. And when it hits, you'll need to choose a side. Make sure you choose wisely. With that, he left the room, leaving Dell alone in the dim, smoky space. She stood there for a long moment, her mind racing. His words, his threat, his seduction had shaken her. She felt off balance, unsure of herself, unsure of everything. She looked out the small, grimy window, her gaze fixed on the gathering clouds on the horizon. He was right. A storm was coming. A storm of greed, of ambition, of violence. And she was caught in the middle of it. As she looked, she saw a flash in the distance. Not lightning, gunfire. And the storm broke, not outside, but within the town. Chapter 11. When lightning strikes the heart of the ranch. The sound of gunfire shattered the tense atmosphere of the saloon. Shouts and screams erupted, followed by the panic scramble of people trying to escape. Dell, her heart pounding, instinctively moved towards the door, her hand reaching for the revolver at her hip. McGraw reappeared, his face grim, his eyes scanning the chaos. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice sharp. "It's not safe." Dell ignored him. She pushed past him, stepping out into the main room of the saloon. The scene that greeted her was one of pandemonium. Tables were overturned, glasses shattered, and men were brawling, their faces contorted with rage and fear. She saw Eben, the old rancher, lying on the floor, a pool of blood spreading around him. He was clutching his chest, his eyes wide with pain and shock. Dell rushed to his side, kneeling beside him.
"Eben,"
she cried, her voice filled with alarm. "What happened?" He gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "McGraw's men, they shot me." Dell's blood ran cold. McGraw? Had he ordered his men to shoot Eben? Because of what he'd told her? She looked around, trying to find the shooter, but the room was a blur of movement and confusion. She saw Jedediah, fighting his way through the crowd, his fists flying. He seemed to be heading towards her, his expression grim and determined. McGraw appeared beside her, his face a mask of cold fury. "Get out of here, Dell," he snarled. "This is none of your concern. He's hurt." Dell protested, gesturing towards Eben. "We need to help him." McGraw grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. "He's a dead man," he said, his voice flat. "And if you don't get out of here, you'll be too." Dell struggled against his grip, her anger rising. "Let go of me,"
she cried.
"I won't leave him." McGraw's eyes narrowed. "You dare defy me?"
he hissed.
Before Dell could respond, Jedediah arrived, shoving McGraw aside with a force that sent him stumbling backwards. "Get her out of here, Jed," McGraw roared.
"Now."
Jed ignored him. He knelt beside Dell, his gaze fixed on Eben. "Can you move him?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. Dell nodded. "I think so." Together, they lifted Eben, his body surprisingly light and frail. They carried him out of the saloon, through the chaotic streets, towards the livery stable. The gunfire had stopped, but the town was still in an uproar. People were running, shouting, their faces filled with fear and confusion. They reached the livery stable, a haven of relative calm in the midst of the storm. Jed led them to a back stall, laying Eben down on a pile of hay. Dell examined his wound, her hands trembling. It was bad, a gunshot wound to the chest. She knew he didn't have much time. "I need bandages," she said, her voice urgent. "And whiskey. Anything to stop the bleeding." Jed nodded. He disappeared into the stable, returning a few moments later with a roll of cloth and a bottle of whiskey. Dell worked quickly, cleaning the wound, applying pressure, trying to stem the flow of blood. But she knew it was futile.
"Eben was fading fast."
He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of pain and peace. "It's all right, girl," he whispered. "It's my time." "Don't say that," Dell pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. "You're going to be all right." He smiled weakly. "Thank you for trying." His eyes closed, his breathing stopped. He was gone. Dell sat there for a long moment, staring at his lifeless body, her heart aching with grief and anger. McGraw had done this. He had killed an innocent man, a man who had only spoken the truth. Jed stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, a silent offer of comfort. "He was a good man," Jed said, his voice low and somber. "He didn't deserve this." Dell nodded, tears streaming down her face. She felt a surge of rage, a burning desire for revenge. McGraw will pay for this, she vowed, her voice trembling with fury. I swear it. Jed looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else. Understanding? Determination? I know he will, Jed said. And I'll be there to help you make sure of it. He put a firm hand on her shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie. But it felt different than McGraw's touch. It was a promise, not a threat. And it originated far, far from the storm that was about to consume them all. Chapter 12. The Price of Loyalty and the Cost of Freedom. The death of Eben cast a long, dark shadow over Dust Devil. The town, already tense and divided, was now a powder keg, ready to explode. Fear and suspicion were rampant, and the lines between friend and foe were blurred. Dell returned to the ranch, her heart heavy with grief and anger. She couldn't shake the image of Eben's lifeless body, the feeling of his blood on her hands. She knew McGraw was responsible, and she was determined to make him pay. But how? She was one woman, against a man with wealth, power, and a ruthless army of enforcers. She had no allies, no one she could trust, except perhaps Jedediah. She found Silas sitting on the porch, his usual posture of defeat. He looked up as she approached, his eyes filled with a flicker of something. Concern? Fear? What happened? He asked, his voice trembling. I heard gunfire. Dell hesitated. She couldn't tell him the whole truth, not yet. It would only add to his burden, his guilt. There was trouble in town, she said, her voice evasive. A fight, someone got shot. Silas nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. He didn't press her for details. He seemed to have lost the will to even care. Dell went inside, the house feeling empty and cold. She couldn't stay here, not tonight. She needed to be somewhere else, somewhere safe. She thought of Jedediah, of his offer of help, of his quiet strength. She decided she would seek him out, tell him everything, ask for his help. She found him at the livery stable, as usual, tending to his horses. He looked up as she approached, his expression guarded. You all right? He asked, his voice concerned. Dell shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. Eben's dead, she said, her voice choked with emotion. McGraw's men, they shot him. Jed's expression hardened. I know, he said, his voice grim. I saw it happen. Dell told him everything about her conversation with Eben, about McGraw's threats, about her growing suspicion that he had killed his own brother. Jed listened patiently, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and understanding. I told you he was a snake, he said, his voice low and bitter. I told you he couldn't be trusted. I know, Dell said, her voice trembling. But what do we do? How do we stop him? Jed hesitated, then said, his voice serious. We need proof, he said. Evidence. Something we can use against him. But where do we find it? Dell asked, her voice desperate. He covers his tracks well. Jed thought for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. There's one place, he said finally. His office. In the Golden Spur. He keeps records, documents everything. If there's any proof, it'll be there. Dell's heart pounded. It was a dangerous plan, risky, almost suicidal. But she couldn't think of anything else. I'll go, she said, her voice determined. Tonight. Jed shook his head. No, he said. It's too dangerous. I'll go. But Dell started to protest. No buts, Jed interrupted, his voice firm. I know the layout of the saloon. I know how to get in and out without being seen. You stay here. It's safer. Dell wanted to argue, to insist on going with him, but she knew he was right. It was too dangerous. And he was better equipped to handle it. She agreed, reluctantly, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Jed left, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Dell alone in the stable. She waited, her nerves on edge, her mind racing. The hours stretched on, long and agonizing. Dell paced the stable, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. She imagined Jed sneaking into the Golden Spur, searching McGraw's office, risking his life to find the truth. Finally, as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, Jed returned. He looked exhausted, his clothes covered in dust, but his eyes held a flicker of triumph. "I found something," he said, his voice low and excited. He held out a small, leather-bound book. His ledger. "It's all here, Dell. Everything." He opened it and showed her. Names, dates, figures. And one entry, clear as day, detailing a payment to a man named Bartlett for services rendered in Eagle Canyon, the day of his brother's death. The price of loyalty, the cost of freedom. Both were steep. Chapter 13. Riding Through the Valley of Shadows. Dell stared at the ledger, her heart pounding. It was all there, in black and white, undeniable proof of McGraw's guilt. The payment to Bartlett, the date, the location, it matched Jed's story, Eben's whispers, her own growing suspicions. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and dread. "This is what we needed." Jed nodded, his expression grim. "It's enough to bring him down," he said. "Enough to expose him for what he is." But Dell knew it wouldn't be easy. McGraw was powerful, influential, and he wouldn't hesitate to use any means necessary to protect himself. He had men, money, and the law on his side, or at least the corrupt elements of it. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Jed thought for a moment, his gaze fixed on the ledger. "We need to get this to someone who can't be bought," he said. "Someone who will uphold the law, someone who will bring McGraw to justice." "Who?" Dell asked, her voice desperate. "Everyone in Dust Devil is either afraid of him or on his payroll." Jed hesitated, then said, his voice low and serious. "There's one man," he said. "Judge Thompson. He's in Tucson. He's known for his integrity, his honesty. He's the only one I can think of who might be able to help." Dell nodded, her mind racing. Tucson was a long ride, dangerous, especially with McGraw's men likely watching every road out of Dust Devil. But they had no choice. "We'll go together," she said, her voice determined. "We'll take the back trails, avoid the main roads. We'll get this to Judge Thompson." Jed nodded, his expression resolute. "We leave at dawn," he said. They spent the rest of the night preparing, gathering supplies, packing their horses. Dell felt a surge of something, adrenaline, perhaps, or fear, or maybe hope. She was risking everything, her life, her family's legacy, but she was doing it for the right reasons. For justice, for truth, for the memory of Eben, for the future of Dust Devil. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky, they set off, riding through the Valley of Shadows, towards an uncertain future. The journey was long and arduous, the terrain rough and unforgiving. They avoided the main roads, sticking to the back trails, the hidden canyons, the forgotten paths. They rode in silence, mostly, their thoughts focused on the task ahead, on the dangers they faced. They were constantly on guard, watching for any sign of pursuit, any hint of McGraw's men. They slept under the stars, wrapped in their blankets, the vast, silent desert their only companion. They shared their meager rations, their stories, their fears. Dell found herself drawn to Jed, to his quiet strength, his unwavering resolve, his kindness. She saw the pain in his eyes, the scars that whispered of a past filled with hardship and loss. She saw the good in him, the decency, the courage that lay beneath his rough exterior. She realized, with a start, that she was beginning to trust him. Completely. And that trust was a dangerous thing. In this world. In this situation. But she couldn't help it. He was her ally, her protector, her friend. One evening, as they were camped in a secluded canyon, Jed spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "I never told you the whole story," he said, his gaze fixed on the flickering campfire. "About McGraw and me." Dell looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" she asked. Jed took a deep breath, then said, his voice trembling slightly. "McGraw and I, we were partners once, back east. We had a business together." Dell's heart pounded. She sensed that this was a confession, a revelation of something dark and painful. "What kind of business?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jed hesitated, then said, his voice flat, emotionless. "We were outlaws," he said. "Robbing trains, banks, living on the edge." Dell was shocked, but not surprised. She'd sensed that there was more to Jed than he'd let on, that he had a past he was hiding. "And what happened?" she asked. Jed's expression hardened. "McGraw, he betrayed me," he said, his voice bitter. "He left me for dead. Took everything. That's how I got this." He touched the scar on his cheek, his fingers tracing its jagged outline. Dell felt a surge of empathy, of understanding. She saw the pain in his eyes, the anger, the desire for revenge. It mirrored her own. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice sincere. He nodded, his gaze returning to the fire. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. He looked up, meeting her gaze with something that seemed very much like her own reflection. And he asked, "We're going to make it through this, aren't we?" It was the closest he'd come to admitting he might need her. Chapter 14. Unmasking the Ghosts of Yesterday. Dell looked into Jed's eyes, seeing the reflection of her own fear, her own determination, her own flickering hope. His question hung in the air, a fragile bridge between them, a shared vulnerability in the face of overwhelming odds. "Yes," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her heart. "We have to." She wouldn't allow herself to doubt, to falter. Too much was at stake. The ranch, Eben's memory, the future of Dust Devil, and something more, something she was only beginning to understand, a connection to this man, this outlaw, this unlikely ally. They continued their journey, the landscape growing harsher, more desolate with each passing mile. They were nearing Tucson, but they were also entering the most dangerous part of their journey, the territory where McGraw's reach was strongest. They rode with caution, their senses heightened, their hands never far from their weapons. They were constantly scanning the horizon, watching for any sign of pursuit. One afternoon, as they were traversing a narrow pass, they saw them. Riders, a dozen or more, blocking their path. McGraw's men. Dell and Jed exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they faced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they wouldn't surrender. "Stay behind me," Jed said, his voice low and steady. He drew his revolver, his eyes narrowing. Dell nodded, her hand reaching for her own gun. She wouldn't be a damsel in distress, a helpless victim. She would fight, beside Jed, for their lives, for their freedom. The riders approached, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. The leader, a burly man with a cruel smile, spoke. Well, he sneered. "Look what we have here. The little rancher girl and the washed-up outlaw. McGraw wants a word with you." Jed didn't reply. He raised his revolver, his aim steady. Dell did the same, her heart pounding, her hand trembling slightly. "We're not going anywhere with you," Dell said, her voice surprisingly strong. The leader laughed, a harsh, mocking sound.
"You don't have a choice," he said.
"McGraw always gets what he wants." "Not this time," Jed said, his voice cold. He fired, his shot ringing out in the narrow pass. The leader slumped in his saddle, his eyes wide with surprise. The other riders opened fire, a hail of bullets whizzing past Dell and Jed. They returned fire, ducking behind rocks, taking cover wherever they could. The gunfight was fierce and brutal, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams of men and horses. Dell fought with a desperation she hadn't known she possessed, her shots finding their mark, bringing down several of the riders. Jed fought with a cold, deadly efficiency, his movements precise, his aim unwavering. He was a skilled gunfighter, experienced, ruthless. He was protecting her, covering her, putting himself in harm's way. One by one, the riders fell, until only a few remained. They turned and fled, disappearing back the way they had come. Dell and Jed were left standing, their bodies bruised and battered, their clothes torn and dusty, but alive. They had survived. They looked at each other, a shared understanding passing between them. They had faced death together, and they had prevailed. They continued their journey, their resolve strengthened, their determination renewed. They reached Tucson the next day, the city a welcome sight after the harshness of the desert. They found Judge Thompson, a stern-faced man with piercing eyes and a reputation for unwavering integrity. They presented him with a ledger, with their story, with their plea for justice. The judge listened patiently, his expression grave. He examined the ledger, his eyes narrowing as he read the incriminating entries. "This is serious," he said, his voice low and serious. "Very serious." He looked at Del and Jed, his gaze unwavering. "You've done a brave thing," he said. "A dangerous thing. But you've done the right thing." He promised them he would act, that he would issue warrants for McGraw's arrest, that he would bring him to justice. Del and Jed felt a surge of relief, of hope. They had done it. They had exposed McGraw. They had taken the first step towards bringing him down. But as they left the judge's office and rode slowly out of town, they knew it was not over. McGraw has friends. He won't go down without a fight. Chapter 15. The thin line between outlaw and savior. The ride back to Dust Devil was filled with a tense anticipation. Del and Jed knew that McGraw would be waiting for them, that he would be prepared, that he would be furious. They had struck a blow against him, but they had also stirred up a hornet's nest. They rode cautiously, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the back trails, their senses heightened, their hands never far from their weapons. They were constantly on guard, watching for any sign of ambush, any hint of McGraw's men. As they neared Dust Devil, they saw smoke rising in the distance, a dark, ominous cloud against the clear blue sky. Their hearts sank. They knew what it meant. They spurred their horses, riding faster, their fear growing with each passing moment. They reached the outskirts of town, and the scene that greeted them was one of devastation. Buildings were burning, smoke filling the air, the streets deserted, except for a few scattered figures, McGraw's men, looting and destroying. The town was in flames. Del's heart ached. This was her home, her community, and McGraw had destroyed it out of spite, out of rage, out of a desperate attempt to maintain his control. They rode through the burning streets, their eyes searching for any sign of survivors, any hint of resistance. They found none. The town was empty, silent, except for the crackling of flames and the occasional shout of McGraw's men. They reached the Golden Spur Saloon, the center of McGraw's operations. It was still standing, but it was surrounded by his men, heavily armed, their faces grim and determined. Del and Jed knew they couldn't confront them directly. They were outnumbered, outgunned. They needed a plan, a strategy. They retreated to the livery stable, Jed's old haunt, a place of relative safety. They dismounted, their horses exhausted, their bodies weary. "What do we do now?" Del asked, her voice filled with despair. "He's destroyed everything." Jed looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and determination. "We fight back," he said, his voice firm. "We take back the town. We finish this." Del nodded, her own resolve hardening. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let McGraw win. She would fight for her home, for her people, for justice.
"How?"
she asked. "We're just two people." Jed smiled, a grim, humorless smile. "We're not alone," he said. "There are others. People who are tired of McGraw's rule, people who are ready to fight. I've been making contacts, gathering allies." Del was surprised and relieved. She hadn't known. Jed had been working behind the scenes preparing for this, building a resistance. "Who?" she asked. Jed named them. A handful of ranchers, shopkeepers, townsfolk, people who had suffered under McGraw's tyranny, people who were willing to risk everything to reclaim their freedom. It wasn't a large force, but it was enough. Enough to make a stand, enough to challenge McGraw, enough to hope. They spent the rest of the day planning, strategizing, preparing for the confrontation. They gathered weapons, ammunition, supplies. They sent messages to their allies, telling them to be ready. As night fell, they made their move. They crept through the darkened streets, their movements silent, their hearts pounding. They were a small band of rebels, outlaws, saviors, fighting for their town, for their lives, for their future. They reached the Golden Spur, their target, the symbol of McGraw's power. They surrounded the building, their weapons drawn, their faces determined. Jed stepped forward, his voice ringing out in the quiet night. "McGraw," He shouted.
Come out.
It's over. The saloon doors swung open, and McGraw stepped out, his face a mask of cold fury. He was surrounded by his men, heavily armed, their eyes filled with hate. You think you can stop me? He sneered. You think you can defeat me? You're fools. It's over, McGraw, Jed repeated, his voice steady.
The judge is on his way.
You're finished. McGraw laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. The judge?
He scoffed.
He's got no jurisdiction here.
This is my town. My law.
He raised his hand, signaling his men. Kill them, he ordered. And with that, the battle began.
But it was more than a gunfight. It was an uprising.
And McGraw was about to discover that he'd underestimated not just Dell and Jed, but the whole town he thought he owned. Chapter 16. Whispers of Rebellion in the Quiet Night. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, shouts, and screams. Dell and Jed, alongside their small band of allies, fought with a fierce determination, fueled by anger, desperation, and a burning desire for justice. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise, and they had the advantage of knowing the town, the alleyways, the rooftops, the hidden passages. They used their knowledge to their advantage, striking quickly, disappearing into the shadows, harassing McGraw's men, disrupting their formations. Dell fought with a skill and courage she hadn't known she possessed. She moved through the darkened streets, her revolver blazing, her aim true. She was protecting her home, her people, her future. Jed fought beside her, a whirlwind of motion, his guns blazing, his movements precise and deadly. He was a seasoned fighter, experienced, ruthless, but tonight he was fighting for something more than survival, something more than revenge. He was fighting for redemption. The townsfolk, inspired by their courage, joined the fight, emerging from their hiding places, armed with whatever weapons they could find: rifles, pistols, knives, even farm tools. They were a ragtag army, but they were united in their hatred of McGraw, in their desire for freedom. The battle raged through the night, the streets of Dust Devil becoming a battlefield. Buildings burned, bullets flew, men fell. The air was thick with smoke, with the acrid smell of gunpowder, with the screams of the dying. Dell found herself face to face with McGraw, his eyes blazing with hatred, his face contorted with rage. He raised his revolver, aiming at her. You, he snarled. You ruined everything. Dell met his gaze, her own eyes filled with defiance. It was already ruined, McGraw, she said, her voice steady. You ruined it. She fired, her shot hitting him in the shoulder, knocking him backwards. He stumbled, but he didn't fall. He raised his gun again, his aim unsteady. Before he could fire, Jed appeared, tackling him to the ground. They wrestled, struggling for control of the gun. Dell watched, her heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to help Jed, but she couldn't risk hitting him. The gun went off, the shot echoing through the night. Dell gasped, her eyes wide with fear. Who had been hit? Jed stood up, slowly, his face grim. McGraw lay on the ground, unmoving, a pool of blood spreading around him. He was dead. The fighting stopped. McGraw's men, seeing their leader dead, their cause lost, surrendered. The battle was over. Dell rushed to Jed's side, her eyes filled with concern. Are you all right? She asked, her voice trembling. He nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I'm fine, he said. Just a scratch. He had a graze on his arm, a minor wound, but nothing serious. Dell felt a surge of relief, of gratitude. He was alive. They had won. The townsfolk gathered around, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and relief. They had done it. They had defeated McGraw. They had reclaimed their town. They had won their freedom. The whispers that had passed between them for so long, the hushed conversations of rebellion, they rose up and echoed through the night. Chapter 17. The Reckoning That Fate Demands. The dawn broke over Dust Devil, revealing a scene of devastation and hope. Buildings were damaged, some destroyed, but the spirit of the town was unbroken. The people emerged from their homes, their faces weary but resolute, ready to rebuild, to start anew. McGraw's body lay in the street, a stark reminder of his tyranny, of his defeat. The law had arrived from Tucson, Judge Thompson leading a contingent of deputies to take control, to restore order, to begin the process of justice. Del and Jed stood together, watching the sunrise, their bodies aching, their clothes torn and dusty, but their hearts filled with a sense of accomplishment, of peace. They had done it. They had faced their demons, they had fought for their freedom, and they had won. Judge Thompson approached them, his expression grave but approving. "You two did a remarkable thing," he said. "You brought down a tyrant, you liberated a town. You should be proud." Del and Jed exchanged a look, a shared understanding passing between them. They weren't heroes, they weren't saviors, they were just ordinary people who had been pushed too far, who had fought for what they believed in. "We just did what we had to do," Del said, her voice quiet. "Justice will be served," Judge Thompson said. "McGraw's men will be arrested, tried, and punished. The stolen land will be returned to its rightful owners. The town will be rebuilt." He paused, then added, his voice softening slightly. "And you two, you have a future here. A chance to build something new, something better." Del and Jed looked at each other, a question in their eyes. What now? What did the future hold for them? They had been brought together by circumstance, by a shared enemy, by a common goal. But now that the enemy was gone, what remained? Del thought of the ranch, of her father, of the life she had left behind. She knew she had to go back, to rebuild, to start over. But she also knew she couldn't go back to the way things were. She had changed. She had been through too much, seen too much, done too much. Jed thought of his past, of his life as an outlaw, of the choices he had made, of the regrets he carried. He knew he couldn't go back to that life. He wanted something different, something better. He looked at Del, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and something else. Something deeper, something unspoken. "I don't have anywhere to go," he said, his voice hesitant.
No país.
"No future." Del met his gaze, her own eyes filled with understanding and something more. Something she was only beginning to recognize, something she was afraid to name. "You could stay," she said, her voice quiet. "Help me rebuild the ranch. Help rebuild the town." Jed's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope in their depths. "You'd want that?" he asked. Del nodded, her heart pounding. "I would," she said. We make a good team." Jed smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. It was the first time Del had seen him smile like that, a smile without pain, without bitterness, without regret. "I reckon we do," he said. They stood there, together, in the growing light of the new dawn, the future stretching before them, uncertain but filled with possibility. They had faced the reckoning that fate had demanded, and they had emerged, scarred but stronger, ready to face whatever came next. Together. And they knew that whatever happened next, the echoes of the past would always follow. But perhaps they were ready for it and could find peace, together. Chapter 18. A Dance with Danger Under the Desert Moon. The weeks following McGraw's death were a blur of activity. Dust Devil slowly began to heal, to rebuild, to emerge from the ashes of its past. The townsfolk, united by their shared struggle, worked together, repairing buildings, clearing debris, restoring a sense of normalcy. Del and Jed worked side by side, their partnership solidifying, their bond deepening. They divided their time between the ranch and the town, helping wherever they were needed. Del focused on restoring the Rollins Ranch, repairing fences, tending to the cattle, reclaiming the land that had been neglected for so long. Jed helped her, his skills as a former outlaw surprisingly useful in the practical tasks of ranching. He was strong, resourceful, and he had a knack for fixing things, for making do with what they had. He also took on the role of protector, keeping a watchful eye on the town, ensuring that McGraw's remaining men didn't cause any further trouble. He was a respected figure in Dust Devil now, a symbol of resistance, of courage, of hope. Del found herself increasingly drawn to him, to his quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty, his kindness. She saw the good in him, the decency that lay beneath his rough exterior, the man he was trying to be. She also saw the pain he still carried, the ghosts of his past that haunted him. She knew he was struggling to reconcile his former life with his new one, to find his place in this new world they were building. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Dell spoke, her voice hesitant. "You never talk about your past," she said.
About before.
Jed looked at her, his expression guarded.
"There's not much to tell," he said.
"It's a past I'd rather forget. But it's a part of you," Dell said. "It's made you who you are." He sighed, his gaze drifting towards the distant mountains. "It's made me an outlaw," he said. "A criminal. A man with blood on his hands." "You're not that man anymore," Dell said, her voice firm.
"You've changed.
"You've proven that." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and hope. "Have I?"
he asked.
Dell nodded, her heart aching for him.
"You have," she said. "You're a good man, Jed."
"You're my friend." He smiled, a slow, tentative smile. "And you're mine, Dell," he said. "You're the best friend I've ever had." He paused, then added, his voice softening slightly. "You're more than that, actually." Dell's heart skipped a beat. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with something she was afraid to name, something that had been growing between them, slowly, subtly, but undeniably. He reached out, his hand covering hers. The touch was warm, gentle, sending a shiver down her spine. He began, his voice hesitant, uncertain. Before he could finish, a shout rang out, followed by the sound of gunfire. They both jumped to their feet, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. A group of riders, masked and armed, were approaching the ranch house, firing their guns. McGraw's men, seeking revenge. "Get inside," Jed ordered, his voice sharp. He pushed Dell towards the door, shielding her with his body. Dell hesitated, wanting to stay and fight, but she knew he was right. She ran inside, grabbing her father's old rifle from the wall. Jed stood his ground, firing back at the riders, his aim steady and true. He was a one-man army, protecting her, protecting the ranch. The gunfight was short but fierce. Jed, with his superior skills, managed to drive off the attackers, sending them fleeing into the night. He returned to the house, his clothes torn and dusty, a graze on his arm, but otherwise unharmed. Dell rushed to him, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps.
"I'm fine," he said.
"Just another scratch." Dell examined his wound, her hands gentle. She cleaned it, bandaged it, her touch lingering longer than necessary. They looked at each other, their faces close, their eyes locked. The unspoken words, the unacknowledged feelings, hung in the air between them. He leaned, his lips softly touching hers. It was tentative, and yet, under the desert moon, it was a beginning. The dance with danger had given them the courage to reach for something more. Chapter 19. The Dawn of Redemption or Ruin. The kiss, brief and tentative as it was, shattered the dam of unspoken emotions that had been building between Dell and Jed. It was a spark in the darkness, a promise of something more, something deeper, something that both thrilled and terrified them. They pulled apart, slightly breathless, their eyes searching each other's, a mixture of wonder and uncertainty in their gaze. Dell began, her voice trembling slightly. "Dell," he echoed, his voice equally hesitant. They didn't need words. The kiss had said it all. It had acknowledged the feelings they had been trying to deny, to ignore, to bury beneath the weight of their shared struggles, their dangerous past. But the world around them was still dangerous, still uncertain. McGraw's men were still out there, seeking revenge, and the scars of the past, both physical and emotional, were still fresh. They knew they couldn't afford to be distracted, to be vulnerable. They had to be strong, to be vigilant, to be ready for whatever came next. But they also knew they couldn't go back to the way things were. The kiss had changed everything. It had opened a door that couldn't be closed, a path that they were both drawn to, despite the risks. They spent the next few days in a state of heightened awareness, both of each other and of the dangers around them. They worked together, side by side, their movements synchronized, their unspoken communication seamless. They were a team, partners, but now there was something more, something deeper, something that colored every interaction, every glance, every touch. They were careful, though, to keep their feelings hidden from the outside world. They couldn't afford to show any weakness, any vulnerability, not with McGraw's men still lurking, not with the town still fragile, still recovering. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, Jed spoke, his voice low and serious. "We need to be careful, Del," he said. It can't distract us. It can't make us weak." Del nodded, her heart aching slightly. She knew he was right. They had to be practical, to be realistic. But she also couldn't deny the feelings that were growing stronger with each passing day. "I know," she said, her voice quiet, "but I can't help how I feel." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and regret.
"Me neither," he said.
"But we have to be strong. For each other. For the ranch.
For the town."
He paused, then added, his voice hesitant. I don't want to hurt you, Del. I don't want to ruin things." Del reached out, her hand covering his. "You won't," she said, her voice firm. "We won't let it." They sat there, together, in the fading light, their hands clasped, their hearts connected, a silent promise passing between them. They would face the future together, whatever it held, whatever dangers it brought. The next morning, a rider arrived at the ranch, a messenger from Judge Thompson in Tucson. He brought news, good and bad. The good news was that most of McGraw's men had been captured, rounded up, and were awaiting trial. The threat of further violence was diminishing. The bad news was that a few of McGraw's most loyal, most dangerous men had escaped, were still at large, and were believed to be heading towards Dust Devil, seeking revenge. Del and Jed knew what they had to do. They had to be ready. They had to protect the town, protect each other. They gathered their allies, the townsfolk who had fought beside them before, the men and women who were willing to risk everything to defend their freedom. They prepared for a final confrontation, a showdown that would determine the fate of Dust Devil, the fate of their future. The dawn arrived, gray and ominous, the air thick with tension, with anticipation, with a sense of impending doom or a new beginning. They were ready. They were waiting. The question wasn't if the men would arrive. It was what would happen after. And they knew, whatever happened, it would be a fight not just for survival, but for their very souls. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The waiting was the hardest part. The tension hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating, like the stillness before a desert storm. Del and Jed, along with their small band of allies, stood ready, their weapons loaded, their nerves on edge, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. They had chosen their ground carefully, the outskirts of Dust Devil, a place where they could use the terrain to their advantage, where they could ambush the attackers, where they could make their final stand. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the desert in hues of gold and orange, they saw them. A small group of riders, approaching from the east, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. McGraw's men. Del and Jed exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they faced, a shared determination to fight, to protect, to survive. "Stay close," Jed said, his voice low and steady. "And be ready for anything." Del nodded, her hand tightening around her rifle. She was afraid, yes, but she was also resolute. She wouldn't back down. She wouldn't surrender. She would fight for her home, for her people, for Jed. The riders approached, their horses kicking up dust, their eyes filled with hate and a thirst for revenge. They were led by a man Del recognized, Bartlett, the man McGraw had paid to kill his brother, the man whose name was etched in the ledger, the man who embodied everything that was rotten and corrupt about McGraw's world. Bartlett raised his hand, signaling his men to halt. He looked at Del and Jed, his face twisted in a sneer. "You can't win," he said, his voice harsh and grating. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. Give up now, and we might let you live." Jed stepped forward, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "We're not giving up," he said.
"This is our town."
"And we're not afraid of you." Bartlett laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "You should be," he said. "We're going to burn this town to the ground, and everyone in it." He raised his hand again, signaling his men to attack. The riders charged, their guns blazing, a hail of bullets whizzing past Del and Jed. The battle began. It was a fierce and brutal fight, a desperate struggle for survival. Del and Jed, along with their allies, fought with a courage and determination that belied their numbers. They used the terrain to their advantage, taking cover behind rocks, trees, buildings, firing back at the attackers, picking them off one by one. Del fought with a skill she hadn't known she possessed, her shots finding their mark, bringing down several of the riders. She was protecting her home, her people, her future, and the man she loved. Jed fought beside her, a whirlwind of motion, his guns blazing, his movements precise and deadly. He was a seasoned fighter, experienced, ruthless, but today he was fighting for something more than survival, something more than revenge. He was fighting for redemption, for a future with Del, for a life free from the shadows of his past. The battle raged, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams of men and horses, the thunder of hooves, the crackle of flames. Del found herself face to face with Bartlett, his eyes blazing with hatred, his gun aimed at her. "It's over, little rancher girl," he snarled. "You're going to die." Del met his gaze, her own eyes filled with defiance. "Not today," she said, her voice steady. She fired, her shot hitting him square in the chest, knocking him backwards. He fell to the ground, his eyes wide with surprise, his body lifeless. With Bartlett dead, the remaining riders lost their nerve. They turned and fled, disappearing back the way they had come, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The battle was over. Del and Jed had won. They stood there, together, amidst the carnage, the smoke, the silence, their bodies bruised and battered, their clothes torn and dusty, but their spirits unbroken. They had faced their final confrontation, and they had prevailed. The townsfolk emerged from their hiding places, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and awe. They had witnessed the courage of Del and Jed, their determination, their love for each other, their love for their town. Del and Jed looked at each other, their eyes meeting, a silent understanding passing between them. They had been through hell and back, they had faced death, they had fought for their freedom, and they had won. But more importantly, they had found each other. As the sun set, it was a fiery red. But whether it symbolized the closing of one chapter, or the dawning of the next, neither of them could say. It was both. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to resilience, to rebuilding, to the enduring power of hope and love. Dust Devil, slowly but surely, rose from the ashes of its past, transforming from a town ruled by fear and greed into a community built on trust, cooperation, and a shared vision for the future. Del and Jed, at the heart of this transformation, worked tirelessly, side by side, their partnership deepening into a love that was as strong and enduring as the land they called home. They rebuilt the Rollins Ranch, expanding it, diversifying it, making it a thriving enterprise, a symbol of their shared success. Silas, Del's father, found a measure of peace in his final years, witnessing his daughter's strength, her happiness, her love for Jed. He saw the ranch, his legacy, restored to its former glory and more. He passed away quietly one evening under a starlit sky, with Del and Jed by his side, a sense of redemption finally settling upon him. Jed shed his outlaw past, embracing his new life as a rancher, a community leader, a husband, and, eventually, a father. He never forgot the lessons he had learned, the mistakes he had made, but he used them to guide him, to make him a better man, a man worthy of Del's love. Del and Jed had children, two strong, independent daughters who inherited their parents' love for the land, their courage, their unwavering sense of justice. They raised their daughters to be strong, to be kind, to be resilient, to be the future of Dust Devil. The Golden Spur Saloon, once a symbol of McGraw's tyranny, was transformed into a community center, a place for gatherings, for celebrations, for the sharing of stories and laughter. The scars of the past remained, visible reminders of the struggles they had endured, but they served as a testament to their strength, their resilience, their ability to overcome adversity. Dust Devil became a haven, a place where people could live in peace, where justice prevailed, where community thrived. It was a town built on the foundations of courage, of love, of a shared commitment to a better future. Del and Jed, as they grew older, often sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, the same sky that had witnessed their struggles, their triumphs, their love. They held hands, their fingers intertwined, their hearts connected, their bond unbreakable. They had faced the storms, they had ridden through the valley of shadows, they had danced with danger, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more in love than ever before. They had found their redemption, their peace, their forever, in the heart of the wild, unforgiving, and beautiful frontier. They had built a life, a legacy, a love story that would be whispered on the desert winds for generations to come. A story of a rancher's daughter and a reformed outlaw who found each other in the midst of chaos and built a future filled with